Welcome to the history section. Okay, let's take a break from William's formative years and get an idea of what was going on in the world around Normandy.
History tells us that the French king in 1041, his power was not what we might imagine.
Not even close. Henry was the head of the very new Capetian dynasty, and he was operating from a position of chronic weakness.
What did he actually control?
Very little. The royal domain, the land he directly ruled, was a small, fragmented territory around Paris and Orléans. We call it the Ile-de-France.
And compared to his own vassals?
It was dwarfed. The lands of the Duke of Normandy or the Count of Anjou or the Duke of Aquitaine were vast in comparison. Henry's power was more symbolic and legal than it was military.
So the king himself is in a fight for survival.
An extremely precarious one. He's being squeezed geographically and politically by these huge regional powers all around him.
And which of these posed the biggest threat to him in 1041?
That's the question that drives all of Henry's actions. He's facing major threats on three fronts at once. To his west, you have Normandy, which is chaotic now, but has immense potential power.
To the southwest?
To the southwest, you have the constant aggressive expansion of the County of Anjou. That was probably his most immediate military problem.
And to the southeast?
The Counts of Blois and Champagne. They were asserting more and more political independence, always pressuring his eastern flank.
So his entire strategy has to be about balance. He can't defeat them.
He can't, so he has to play them off against each other.
And that brings his decision to support the young William into much sharper focus. It's not about feudal loyalty, it's about self-preservation.
It is entirely about self-preservation. We see him sending troops, committing his own resources to help William put down these Norman rebellions. On the surface, it looks like a good lord supporting his vassal.
But the reality is much colder.
The reality is a cold, hard calculation. Henry is choosing what he perceives to be the lesser of two evils.
But wait, if Normandy is so weak and chaotic, why doesn't Henry just invade and take it for himself? Seize the opportunity.
That's the key. He simply doesn't have the resources. A full-scale invasion of Normandy would require all his strength, leaving him completely exposed to Anjou in the south.
And even if he succeeded?
He would inherit a civil war. He would have to spend years and a fortune trying to pacify all those rebellious Norman barons himself. It would drain his kingdom dry.
So what was his real fear?
His real fear was what would happen if he did nothing. He was terrified that if the young William failed, the person who would rise from the ashes of that civil war would be a new, strong, battle-hardened Norman usurper.
Someone like one of those powerful barons.
Exactly. A man from the Bellum family, for instance, a proven warrior who would just unify the entire duchy by force. That man would then turn his newly consolidated Norman military machine directly against the French king.
So by supporting William,
he's maintaining a weak, chaotic, but predictable buffer state on his border. He's keeping a 13-year-old on the throne who is completely dependent on Henry's support for survival.
He's preserving the chaos, but in a contained way.
Perfectly put. A strong, unified Normandy under a new adult ruler was a far greater threat to the Capetians than a weak Normandy led by a boy. By propping William up, Henry was buying himself time. And that intervention, driven entirely by fear, is what gave William the breathing room he needed to survive.
Let's turn our attention north now, across the Channel to England and Scandinavia. In 1041, the great Viking empire of Cnut the Great is in its final, brutal sunset.
It is. England is being ruled by Harthacnut, Cnut's son, and the last Viking king to rule England.
And his reign was not a popular one.
That's an understatement. The atmosphere in England in 1041 was one of pure terror and resentment. Harthacnut ruled by fear. He came to the throne through force, and he governed with a severity that alienated almost everyone.
He didn't reign for very long, but he made a significant impact. And there's one specific event from 1041 that really illustrates the nature of his rule. The Danegeld crisis.
Yes, the Danegeld. There's a deep irony here. The Danegeld was originally a tax the Saxon kings had levied to pay off Viking raiders.
To persuade them to leave?
Right. But now, in 1041, a Viking king is levying this same crushing tax on the English population to pay for his own administration and, more specifically, his massive Danish fleet and mercenaries.
So the English are being taxed by the invader to keep the invader in power.
An incredibly bitter pill to swallow. And the tax was crippling. So when the city of Worcester, a major trading hub in Mercia, refused to pay, Harthacnut's response was apocalyptic.
This wasn't just a punitive fine.
Oh no, this was an act of state terror, designed to be a lesson to everyone else. The unrest began when the people of Worcester killed his royal bodyguards who were there to collect the tax.
And his retribution.
Swift and total. He dispatched a massive military force under his most powerful earls with one order: exact vengeance. The city was besieged, looted, and then systematically burned to the ground.
Deliberately destroyed.
Completely. A deliberate annihilation of a major Anglo-Saxon center. This act showed just how unsustainable the Viking regime had become. It was based purely on extraction and intimidation, and that very instability forced Harthacnut, who was not a healthy man, to think about the succession.
Which brings us to a decision with enormous consequences. Harthacnut could feel his time was short. He would, in fact, die the next year, 1042, collapsing at a wedding feast.
A rather dramatic end. And knowing he was ill and had no children, he makes a choice in 1041 that changes the course of English history and directly sets the stage for 1066.
He invites his half-brother Edward back from exile.
He does. He recalls Edward from Normandy, effectively naming him as his heir. And this Edward, who would become known as Edward the Confessor, had spent decades living at the Norman ducal court.
So his return isn't just a change in dynasty, it's a cultural shift.
A profound one. Edward comes back to England completely steeped in Norman culture. He thinks and acts like a Norman nobleman.
How deep did this influence run? Was it just language and courtly manners?
It was much deeper than that. He'd lived there since he was a child, relying on the Norman dukes for protection and money. His closest friends, his most trusted advisors, his personal chaplains, they were almost all Normans.
So he has no connection to the powerful English earls like Godwin of Wessex?
None at all. When he becomes king, he naturally surrounds himself with the people he knows and trusts. And those people are the Normans who came back with him.
So Harthacnut's decision in 1041, bringing Edward home, essentially opens the door for Norman influence to flood into the English court.
It's the moment the door creaks open. And this is happening at the exact same time that young William is fighting for his life back in Normandy. The timing is incredible.
While William is just trying to secure his own inheritance, his future prize, England, is being prepared for his arrival by its own king.
That's right. Edward starts appointing Normans to key positions in the church and state. He appoints a Norman, Robert of Jumièges, as Archbishop of Canterbury. The foundation for William's later claim on the throne, which was based on a supposed promise from Edward, was really laid 25 years earlier, in 1041.
Let's stay in the north for a moment, but look at Scandinavia itself. The relationship between Norway and Denmark in 1041 was tense.
Extremely tense. And this tension produced a treaty that would provide the direct legal justification for the other invasion of England in 1066, the one that lands at Stamford Bridge.
We're talking about the relationship between Magnus the Good, the King of Norway, and Harthacnut, who ruled both Denmark and England.
Yes. It was a classic dynastic standoff. Magnus had a strong claim to the Danish throne, but Harthacnut was preoccupied. He was trying to keep a lid on the boiling pot in England and simply couldn't afford a full-scale war with Norway at the same time.
So rather than fight a war they couldn't afford, they made a deal.
A famous and fateful oath. The treaty they signed had brutally simple terms.
Which were?
Whichever one of them died first without a direct heir, the other would inherit his entire kingdom.
A political survivor takes all agreement.
Exactly. It was meant to stop a war in the short term, but it created a massive ticking time bomb.
And it was a huge strategic gamble for Harthacnut.
A terrible one, in hindsight. Harthacnut was known to be in poor health and had no children. Magnus was young and healthy. The treaty was a massive strategic coup for the Norwegians.
Because the moment Harthacnut dies in 1042?
Magnus immediately, and with full legal justification from their treaty, claims the throne of Denmark and the throne of England.
So even as Edward the Confessor is taking power in England, there is already another king in Norway who believes he is the rightful ruler.
And he has a signed treaty to prove it. This is what's so critical. This treaty, active in 1041, locks in a Norwegian claim to the English throne. It guaranteed that England's next king would face a challenge from the north.
And that claimant would eventually be Harald Hardrada.
Magnus's successor.
Yeah.
He's the one who would exploit this old claim in 1066. The existence of this treaty is what forces King Harold Godwinson to march his army north to fight Hardrada at Stamford Bridge.
Which, of course, exhausts his army right before he has to turn around and march south to face William at Hastings.
Precisely. William's ultimate victory was made possible, in part, by a diplomatic agreement made between two Scandinavian kings a quarter of a century earlier.
Let's shift our focus south now to the border of Normandy. While the duchy is consumed by civil war, the county of Anjou is becoming a military superpower.
Yes, Anjou represents William's most dangerous long-term rival, and a critical transition of power happened there just before 1041.
This is the death of Fulknera.
Fulk the Black, an absolute legend of his time, a brilliant, brutal, and relentless ruler who had spent decades building castles and militarizing his state. In 1040, he dies and leaves this powerful, unified county to his son, Geoffrey.
Geoffrey Martel.
A hammer. The name says it all. He was the embodiment of controlled, ruthless aggression. If William in 1041 represents youth and chaos, Geoffrey Martel represents maturity, unity, and raw ambition.
A very dangerous neighbor for a boy duke.
The most dangerous. And he wasn't sitting still. In this pivotal year, 1041, Geoffrey was already on the move, proving he would be even more aggressive than his father.
But his focus wasn't on Normandy, not yet.
Not directly. His first move was to crush his rivals to the south, in the territory of Poitou.
Why there?
Because controlling Poitou meant controlling major trade routes and strategic rivers. It would massively increase Anjou's wealth and secure its southern flank. By dealing with Poitou first, he was clearing the chessboard.
Securing his rear before turning his attention north.
Exactly. The campaign in 1041 was a clear statement of intent. It showed everyone that Anjou was on the march. It meant that by the time William finally managed to stabilize Normandy, he would be facing an Angevin state that was richer, stronger, and laser-focused on Normandy's southern border.
So this conflict was just inevitable.
Completely unavoidable. The two states were destined to clash over border territories like Maine and the Vexin. Geoffrey Martel was, without question, the great military rival of William's early adulthood. He was a constant looming threat that forced William to become a master of war just to survive.
We have one final piece of the puzzle to look at. The northern power broker, the county of Flanders.
And Flanders is a complete contrast to everyone else we've discussed. In a landscape of instability and aggression, Flanders was an island of wealth and stability.
Ruled by Count Baldwin V. What was the source of this stability?
It was economic and fundamentally different from its neighbors. While Normandy and Anjou were agricultural and feudal societies, Flanders was, well, it was a mercantile industrial engine.
Driven by the wool trade.
Entirely. Flanders imported raw wool, especially from England, processed it in its cities like Bruges and Ghent into the finest textiles in Europe, and then exported that cloth everywhere.
And this trade generated enormous wealth.
A massive, reliable cash flow. This meant that Count Baldwin was fiscally independent. He didn't have to rely on the whims of his barons or a good harvest for his revenue. He had cash.
Which translates directly into political power.
It does. It gives him immense leverage. Baldwin became known as the kingmaker of the region because he was so financially secure, he could afford to play the long game.
And he used this wealth for diplomacy, not just conquest.
That was his primary tool. His wealthy and secure court became a famous sanctuary for political exiles from all over Europe. He would harbor enemies of the German emperor or nobles fleeing the French court.
Which gave him leverage over those rulers.
Huge leverage. If a king wanted his rebellious cousin sent home, he had to negotiate with Baldwin. It made Flanders a power whose opinion mattered in every major dispute.
So for the young William in Normandy, insecure and fighting for his life, Flanders represents something essential.
It represents a necessary future ally. With the threat of Anjou to the south, William simply could not afford to have a powerful and wealthy state like Flanders on his northern border as an enemy.
He needed them on his side.
He needed an ironclad alliance. Flanders had everything he lacked: stability, money, and international prestige. Okay, let's shift now to one of the most pivotal relationships for William, that with his elder cousin Edward the Confessor. First, let's look at the circumstances that led Edward being exiled not once, but twice to Normandy, and his inevitable influence over the young Duke William during his formative years.
Well, that framework is absolutely essential. It's really the only way to trace the origins of the 1066 crisis.
Right.
Edward, the future king of England, didn't just, show up in Normandy by chance.
It wasn't a holiday.
Not at all. His refuge there was the direct result of a complete collapse of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty and his maternal blood ties, specifically his mother, Queen Emma, being the sister of the Norman Duke. That connection was everything.
It turned a family tie into a political lifeline.
Precisely. A profound strategic political dependency. So to really understand William's eventual claim, we have to start with Edward's absolute dependence on that Norman court during his formative years.
Okay, so if we're going to grasp that dependency, we have to start at the beginning, with the instability that drove them out of England in the first place. And that means we have to talk about Edward's father, King Athelred II, a figure whose entire reign is really defined by failure.
And by that epithet, the unready, it's just damning.
It really is.
Ethelred's rule, it really sets the stage for the complete destruction of the House of Wessex. Edward was born around 1003, right into the middle of this escalating crisis.
A crisis of Viking aggression.
Sustained and escalating aggression, yes. Ethelred was just chronically incapable of managing it. And that name, the unready, or unread in Old English, it's
Yeah.
actually a kind of devastating medieval pun.
It doesn't just mean unprepared, does it?
No, it's more like ill-advised or lacking counsel. And
No.
that speaks volumes about his failed policies, the constant infighting, and just a fundamental inability to organize a unified defense against the Scandinavians.
And one of the most visible failures of that policy was the Danegeld. Can we talk a bit about the damage those payments caused?
We have to. The practice began as a way to, buy some temporary peace, a bribe, essentially.
But it became something else entirely under Ethelred.
It became institutionalized extortion. England at the time was one of the wealthiest regions in Europe, and these payments, these vast sums of silver raised through just crushing taxation,
Yeah.
they did a few things at once.
Economically, it must have been a disaster.
A complete drain on the kingdom's resources. But politically, and this is maybe more important, it just fundamentally undermined the authority of the king.
So,
By repeatedly paying the Vikings to leave, Athelred was essentially subsidizing their return. He was broadcasting to all of Europe that the English crown lacked the military and political strength to protect its own borders.
which just encouraged them to come back for more.
Exactly. It emboldened them, and eventually it made them change their entire objective.
And that shift in objective is the critical turning point. This is what directly causes Edward's first exile. By the time he was a young boy, the threat had changed.
Precisely. The calculus shifts completely in 1013. The Danish goal was no longer just extortion. It became full-scale political conquest, regime change.
And the man leading this was the Danish king, Sweyn Forkbeard.
A formidable figure. His invasion wasn't a raid, it was a systematic campaign. He had overwhelming military force, and crucially, he was getting support from English lords who were defecting.
So the English resistance just crumbled.
It was the end of effective resistance under Ethelred. The military was fractured, the treasury was empty.
And the collapse, according to the accounts we have, was incredibly fast. Ethelred lost the support of the nobility and realized he couldn't even defend London.
Right. So the decision was made not to defend the territory, but to get the immediate royal family to safety. Specifically the young heirs, Edward and Alfred, who would have been in mortal danger if Sweyn captured them.
And this is where Normandy becomes their salvation. For the first time in 1013.
Athelred sends Queen Emma and the children, including Edward, who's about 10 years old at this point, across the Channel. It was an emergency measure, but the choice of destination was, well, it was the only choice they had.
He was heading to the court of his maternal uncle, Duke Richard II of Normandy. And we have to remember, this is William the Conqueror's grandfather.
That's the key connection. The English royals were seeking shelter directly from their powerful continental relatives, relying completely on the protection of the Duchy of Normandy.
Which was, at the time, a rapidly centralizing and very militaristic state.
And this first exile, even though it was brief, it sets a crucial precedent. For a 10-year-old Edward, it wasn't just moving house, it was his first real immersion into Norman court culture, its language.
Norman French.
Right, and the whole world of continental politics. It gave him this tangible proof that his mother's family, the Dukes of Normandy, could offer safety and stability.
A sharp contrast to the chaos and collapse he'd left behind in his father's kingdom.
A very sharp contrast. It plants the seed of reliance. The idea that salvation for the English throne might not be found in Wessex, but across the water in Rouen.
But then, this first exile ends pretty quickly.
It does. Sweyn Forkbeard dies unexpectedly in 1014. And this power vacuum allows Athelred and the family to make a temporary return to England and try to regain control.
But history shows this was just a brief calm before an even bigger storm. A storm that would cement Edward's destiny in exile for good.
That storm had a name, Cnut, Sweyn's son. Cnut came back, and he was determined to finish what his father had started. And the events of 1016, they are perhaps the most brutal and pivotal in the total destruction of the House of Wessex.
It has been called the Year of Three Kings.
And for good reason. It's a period of incredibly compressed, brutal dynastic collapse. First, in April 1016, King Athelred finally dies, probably of illness, while he's under siege in London.
Which plunges the kingdom into a succession crisis at the worst possible moment.
The absolute worst moment. The immediate successor is Edward's older half-brother, Edmund Ironside. and he proved to be a much more capable military leader than his father.
So what followed was this War of the Brothers, a conflict between Edmund and Cnut for the kingdom.
A brutal, short, mobile war. Edmund's tenacity is what earned him the name Ironside. He gets crowned by the Witan in London, but at the same time, Cnut is being crowned by his own supporters in Southampton.
So England has two kings.
Two kings fighting for one throne, and Edmund fought heroically, but the internal divisions in England, the years of failed leadership under his father, it was too much. Plus, the Danish army was simply a superior military force.
And the decisive moment comes at the Battle of Ascendon.
In October 1016, yes, a definitive Danish victory. It crushed what was left of organized English resistance. Afterwards, the two leaders actually agreed to partition the kingdom.
But even that compromise didn't last.
It was incredibly short-lived. In November 1016, just a month after the treaty, Edmund Ironside dies.
Officially from illness, but the timing has always been suspicious.
Very suspicious. The chroniclers certainly speculated about foul play, and whether it's true or not, it highlights the general understanding that Cnut was ruthless and would eliminate any threat to his power.
So with Ethelred and Edmund both gone, the path was clear.
Instantaneously clear. Cnut becomes the undisputed sole king of all England. The ancient royal line of Wessex was, for all intents and purposes, finished, and the remaining princes, Edward and his brother Alfred, were left completely exposed.
High on Cnut's target list.
Number 1 on the list. This transition from conquest to undisputed kingship meant Cnut had to move fast to solidify his hold, and that meant a purge of any potential dynastic rivals.
He couldn't leave any rallying points for future resistance.
Absolutely not. A living, legitimate English prince is a perpetual threat to his new Anglo-Scandinavian empire, so his first priority was to execute or exile any of Alred's remaining sons.
And the danger became real very quickly.
It did, with the swift execution of Edward's other remaining brother, Edwig. That act showed everyone Cnut's ruthlessness and made it crystal clear what would happen to Edward and Alfred if they were caught.
So they had no choice. They had to flee.
It wasn't a calculated move, it was a desperate escape for their lives. They fled back to Normandy immediately. They were now bona fide political refugees with effectively a bounty on their heads.
And it's really important to distinguish this second exile from the first one.
Paramount. The first flight in 1013 was a temporary evacuation. The expectation was that they would return. This was different.
This was permanent.
Fundamentally different. It was based on a permanent dynastic replacement secured by conquest and political assassination. Edward was now a direct claimant to a throne held by a foreign power. He was an exile, not a guest, and his entire future was now tied to the Norman dukes.
So if the military conquest forced Edward out, what followed was something more personal, this great betrayal that sealed his dependence on Normandy.
This is, I think, the most painful part of the story for Edward personally. You would expect his mother, Queen Emma, to join her sons in the only safe place left, her ancestral home in Normandy.
But that's not what she did.
She made a profoundly calculated, and for her sons, devastating political choice. King Cnut, who was a pragmatist, understood he needed to legitimize his rule.
He couldn't rule by force alone?
No. So he sought to marry Queen Emma, the widow of the king he had just defeated. This move would instantly link him to the old House of Wessex and offer a veneer of continuity to the English nobles.
And the truly staggering thing is that Emma agreed. She married the Viking conqueror in 1017.
She did. And for Edward, this must have been just a gut-wrenching betrayal. For his mother, preserving her own power and status as Queen of England, it superseded her loyalty to her sons from her first marriage.
It's the specific details of the marriage contract that are so brutal.
That's where the personal tragedy becomes a dynastic maneuver. As part of the agreement, Emma consented that any children she had with Cnut, with her new husband, would take precedence in the line of succession.
Disinheriting her own sons.
Legally and functionally disinheriting Edward and Alfred. Cnut's future Danish-English children were now the heirs to the English throne. She chose to remain Queen of England over protecting the Anglo-Saxon line.
So Emma goes back to England to sit on the throne next to the man who crushed her family, and her sons are just abandoned in Normandy.
Essentially, yes. Left as political orphans under the guardianship of their Norman relatives. And the research is very clear that this caused a profound, lifelong rift between Edward and his mother.
This isn't just family drama, it's politically critical.
It is, because it helps explain Edward's adult personality and his policies when he eventually becomes king. He felt intensely betrayed. His own mother prioritized her status over his birthright.
which could only have strengthened his bonds with his Norman cousins.
It absolutely did, the
Yeah.
ducal dynasty. They were the family that actually gave him shelter, protection, and the political capital to keep his claim alive, all while his own mother was actively working to disinherit him.
So his reliance on the Norman dukes wasn't just political necessity. It was anchored in this deep emotional reality. Normandy wasn't just his refuge, it became his psychological home.
That's a great way to put it. The trauma of abandonment shaped him. And he spent the next quarter century, from 1016 to 1041, as a dependent guest of the Norman dukes.
25 years. That's not a short visit. That's an entire lifetime, from age 13 to 38.
It's the entire arc of his young adulthood and maturity. He grew up completely steeped in Norman culture, its customs, its language, and its very specific brand of continental feudal politics.
Let's spend some time on that 25-year period. What would he have been absorbing? Normandy was one of the most dynamic political entities in Europe at the time.
His acculturation would have been almost total. His primary language at court would have been Norman French. His Old English would have atrophied. His education would have been in the Norman style, emphasizing chivalric ideals, religious reform.
He would have seen the practicalities of ducal administration up close.
Yes, this wasn't just academic. He was a political operative watching statecraft in action. He would have witnessed firsthand the centralization of power in the duchy. Unlike the fragmented earldoms of England, the Norman dukes were consolidating their grip on their nobility through a highly structured feudal system.
A system that worked.
A system that was very effective. He saw the use of castles for power projection, the power of Norman heavy cavalry, the loyalty of the professional knights, the Mylites who were the core of the duke's strength.
So when he eventually becomes King of England himself, his preference for Norman advisors wasn't just about playing favorites.
Not at all. It was a practical deployment of the administrative and military technology he had seen working successfully for a quarter of a century. It was what he knew.
Initially, Edward was a dependent under his uncle, Duke Richard II. But he was always more than just a relative seeking shelter, wasn't he?
Oh, always. He was a legitimate, exiled English prince, a high-value political asset that the Normans could and would deploy against the Anglo-Danish regime when the time was right.
And that political investment in him becomes very explicit under William's father, Duke Robert I.
Robert the Magnificent, yes. When he became duke in 1027, he was ambitious. He saw an opportunity, and he actively attempted to restore Edward to the English throne.
And this was a genuine military attempt, not just political posturing.
No, the sources are clear on this. Robert I prepared a substantial invasion fleet. He gathered ships and troops with the explicit goal of crossing the Channel and installing Edward as king.
Which demonstrates that the Normans weren't just offering charity. They saw Edward's restoration as a strategic foreign policy goal.
He was their geopolitical instrument, a way to project Norman power across the Channel.
And the only thing that stopped the invasion was a storm.
A storm wrecked the fleet, and Robert had to turn back. But the intent was clear. The Normans were willing to spend blood and treasure to put Edward on the throne. Edward would never forget that they were the only power willing to fight for him.
Then we have the final crucial shift in roles, which brings us directly to William.
Right. Duke Robert I goes on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and dies on the return journey in 1035. This leaves the Duchy of Normandy to his illegitimate son, William, who is only about 7 or 8 years old.
The boy Duke.
The boy Duke. And suddenly, the entire relationship inverts.
The adult Edward, the veteran refugee, is now in a position to be a stabilizing presence for the young William, an emotional anchor. He's described as having a demeanor that was gentle, safe, and nurturing.
And that gentleness, in a court like that, it wasn't a weakness, it was a profound asset.
A vital contrast to the ruthless, violent, often drunken atmosphere of the Norman court. Edward was an adult male, so he offered a sense of protection, but he was English and exiled, so he offered safe protection.
Now, one could push back a bit here. Is it possible we're romanticizing what might have just been convenience? Edward was a guest. He had nothing else to do but wait. Couldn't his gentleness just be the demeanor of a man with no power?
That's a fair point, and it's why the non-threatening aspect is so fundamental. Edward had no designs on William's power. He didn't want William's duchy.
Right. His ambition was directed elsewhere.
Completely elsewhere. Across the Channel, toward a prize entirely separate from Normandy. That eliminates the motive of threat that was inherent in almost every other male relative or baron.
In a world of predators, he was a benign observer.
And that makes him uniquely reliable. For a young, traumatized William, this figure provided a kind of psychological security. It let the boy have a relationship with a powerful adult male that wasn't dangerous or transactional.
You also have to factor in Edward's deep spiritual focus,
Yes. Even in exile, history tells us he maintained a life of piety. He wanted, quote, a quiet life of prayer.
which cemented his status as a non-political, non-military figure in that court. He was an observer, not a player in the local Norman power games.
So the core outcome is that Edward functions as a true sanctuary for William. He provided essential stability during a chaotic, terrifying childhood.
What's the impact of that emotional debt on William's later character? He's known for being quite ruthless.
The debt is, well, it's immeasurable. The experience of safety and nurturing care during that critical developmental window, from age 7 to 13, it must have weighed on him for decades.
So this sanctuary was the bedrock that allowed him to survive.
It allowed him to develop the immense inner confidence and control he later showed, rather than becoming, completely broken by his early trauma. The man who provided that security, Edward, became the person William was arguably most personally beholden to.
Now let's flip the perspective and look at Edward, the childless father.
Right. We know his primary ambition during this time was singular: reclaiming England. That was the center of his world in exile.
Yeah.
But his personal life had this huge, specific void.
And that void is defined by one of his most famous personal decisions.
The fact that he famously took a vow of celibacy. This meant he was, by his own choice, destined to be childless. And this was despite his eventual marriage to Edith of Wessex, which happened much later, and was famously unconsummated.
That vow of celibacy is fascinating for a medieval royal. It's almost political suicide. What does that tell us about his mindset? Was it purely religious?
It seems to be, yes, driven primarily by his piety, but the political implications were enormous. The first duty of a monarch was to provide an heir, to guarantee stability.
By taking this vow, he's consciously removing himself from that dynastic cycle.
He was signaling that his kingship, if he ever got it, would be dedicated to spiritual matters, not to founding a dynasty.
Which created a profound lack in his personal life, the absence of a son, a void that existed whether he ever got back to England or not.
And we should remember his age. He was in his late 20s, early 30s during this time, the prime age for starting a family, yet he was politically paralyzed and personally abstinent.
So his political life is focused on a distant throne, and his personal life has this gaping hole where a child should be.
And it's into that very void that the young William steps.
So Edward didn't need William the Duke so much as he needed William the boy.
I think that's exactly right. William is described as this bright, energetic boy running around the court. He represented vitality, the future, potential, everything Edward, the aging, perpetually exiled prince, had given up.
You can just imagine the contrast. Edward, quiet, perhaps melancholy, praying. And then there's this dynamic, sharp child navigating a court full of dangers.
It must have cemented the emotional investment Edward placed in him. William became the son Edward would never have.
This elevates their relationship. William isn't just a political relative. He's a quasi-foster son, fulfilling a deep paternal longing.
And it creates a power dynamic that isn't about military strength at all. Edward, in his midlife, was able to provide the one thing he couldn't generate himself: a legacy of paternal care.
By providing safety to the future Duke of Normandy, he secured an emotional bond that was probably stronger than any formal treaty could ever be.
And the synthesis of this mutual dependence is where the argument becomes so powerful. It's the perfect intersection of their specific, unrelated voids.
William needed a non-threatening, nurturing father figure to survive.
And Edward needed a vital, energetic son figure to fill the void left by his celibacy. Neither of them was looking for what the other was offering politically, not in 1035.
No, Edward was just trying to survive in exile. William was just trying to survive, period.
Their connection was based entirely on deep human necessity, on security, and, you could argue, a form of love. This trust transcended standard agreements and established a relationship rooted in familial, not feudal terms.
It's compelling to think that the great consequence of this, the Norman conquest, might have been the result of two men satisfying their personal emotional needs decades earlier.
And that brings us to the analytical implications of this bond, because it has profound consequences for later geopolitical decisions.
Specifically, the English succession. We have to consider how Edward's role as William's sanctuary and surrogate father could have influenced his decisions later in his reign.
The weight of this personal bond may well have superseded other political or familial ties when Edward, much later, had to consider who his heir would be.
And that was an almost impossible political problem for him. He returned to England in 1042, but he had no direct heir because of his vow.
Right. His closest legitimate blood relative was his great-nephew, Edgar Atheling. But Edgar was young, he lacked support. There was also Edward the Exile, his nephew, who had a strong claim but was a political unknown in England.
And then, of course, you had the enormously powerful Anglo-Saxon magnates, led by Harold Godwinson, who fully expected the throne to stay within England.
So William's claim, despite him being non-English, seems uniquely compelling on an emotional level because of this shared personal history.
If Edward truly saw William as the son he never had, that bond becomes a powerful determinant, maybe even a sacred obligation that outranks blood or political convenience.
Let's contrast his claim against his most powerful rival, Harold Godwinson.
Yeah.
Harold's claim rested on political power, his family ties. He was Edward's brother-in-law and English precedent. The idea that the Witenagemot had the right to elect a capable English king.
So how could an emotional debt to a Norman duke possibly outweigh that kind of pragmatic, localized political strength?
Because of the nature of kingship and Edward's own piety, he was Edward the Confessor, a man increasingly focused on spiritual merit and personal vows. For him, a promise, especially one rooted in profound gratitude, would have held immense moral weight.
So Harold represented practical English politics.
And William represented the stability of his exile and the fulfillment of a paternal role. It was a choice between the political and the profoundly personal.
There's the suggestion that Edward may have promised the throne to William during a visit in 1051. If that happened, it wasn't just a political deal, it was an affirmation of that familial bond.
An oath sworn by a king is powerful, but an emotional debt owed to someone who literally saved you from a terrifying childhood that could be stronger than any oath taken later in life, certainly stronger than the political maneuvering of the Godwins.
It's all a matter of perception, isn't it? To the Anglo-Saxons, William was a foreign warlord. To Edward, he was the product of his greatest act of personal nurturing.
The psychological foundation laid in Normandy between 1035 and 1041 gave William a crucial advantage: the belief that he held the legitimate, promised succession. Harold Godwinson had political claims. William had the claim of the surrogate son.
Beyond the succession, there's also the transformation of William's ambition itself. The stability Edward provided in those critical years was essential not just for his survival,
but for his psychological development. As we discussed, a 7-year-old surrounded by constant violence and betrayal would likely develop into a profoundly unstable or paranoid adult.
But William's later ruthlessness, his organizational skill, his strategic clarity, they all point to an adult who was fundamentally secure in his own identity and power.
And that security could only have been nurtured during those chaotic early years by a safe influence. Edward's gentle, safe influence gave William that foundational security, allowing him to grow into the formidable figure he became.
Which leads to a fascinating paradox.
Yes, that Edward, the gentle, non-aggressive spiritual figure, might have paradoxically enabled William's later ruthless ambition.
He provided the quiet, safe background that allowed William to survive the violence of his own court long enough to seize control.
And develop the will necessary to claim the ultimate prize, England. The sanctuary years didn't teach William gentleness.
No, but they prevented his spirit from being crushed by perpetual childhood terror. They provided the security base for his innate will and political skill to emerge.
When you look at the immense power William wielded in 1066, consolidating the duchy, building castles, raising that invasion force, that level of sustained focus requires incredible psychological resilience.
And the argument is that he owed that fundamental resilience to the unconditional, non-threatening care provided by Edward during the most dangerous phase of his life.
Ultimately, this analysis suggests that the Battle of Hastings wasn't just a conflict of armies. It was a violent reckoning based on a 6-year period of shared emotional vulnerability in Normandy decades earlier.
It forces us to acknowledge the immense power of personal psychology in shaping these world-changing events. The deepest currents of history often flow from the individual heart, not just the battlefield.
I agree. And this look into the 1035 to 1041 period forces a reassessment of Edward's motivations. His choice of William as his heir was perhaps less a cold political maneuver and more the fulfillment of a deeply held, intensely personal paternal bond.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive. and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.